So in our last class, we looked at the role of Vichy France, the French government during the Second World War, and we concluded with the liberation of Paris. And in this class, what I want to talk about is the efforts to rebuild France after the Second World War. So what was the sentiment after Paris had been liberated, after France was freed from the Nazis? Broadly, it was one of relief. Here we have Nicolas Cage demonstrating what relief looks like, if you're not sure. So France was certainly very relieved. Immediately the question turned to how can we prevent this tragedy from ever happening again? How can we prevent the calamity of 1940 from ever being repeated? A lot of people firstly felt the blame for the calamity lay with the institutions of the Third Republic, both the institutions and the people who were involved with them. And so therefore, at least initially, there was a growing desire to, whatever we're going to do, we're not going to make the mistakes of the past. A referendum was held in October 1945 on the French constitutional question, asking people whether they wanted to preserve the constitution of the Third Republic, and it was rejected by 93% of the voters. So there was a very, very strong disdain, firstly, the institutions of the Third Republic, and then for the people who participated in the Third Republican government itself. And generally, they were to be excluded from the rebuilding of France, because those people who they felt were responsible for the fall of France in 1940, were kind of not to be included in this new French Republic. Of course, while there was disdain for those who were responsible, or at least who were held to be responsible for France's defeat in 1940, there was anger and outrage at those who participated in the Vichy government. As the Nazis were driven out of France, there was a wave of spontaneous attacks upon French people who had participated with the Nazi effort. So what's known as the Purge, same as the Amazon series, that essentially attacks were carried out outside any kind of legal due process upon those who participated. It's estimated perhaps 10,000 people were murdered, lynched, whatever word you want to use, for their role in some level of participation with the Nazi government. So that's outside of the process of the state itself. The state France did capture many of the leaders of the Vichy government, obviously the most important being Marshal Philippe Pétain. He was put on trial, and I want to show you this video just to give you some insight into Pétain's trial. So here we go.
This is the Palais de Justice, where Pétain, Marshal of France and hero of Verdun, is on trial for his life on charges of plotting against the internal security of his country and collaboration with the enemy. On the day before the trial, the Marshal arrived in the French equivalent of a Black Maria. He was taken in through the back door and then went to a specially prepared flat over the court where he is living during the trial. The windows were blocked to prevent any possible attempt on his life, and guards kept careful watch on the roof. And now the day of the trial itself. Special precautions had been taken, and additional guards were there to preserve order. They were certainly needed, as you'll see in a moment. In stifling heat, the packed court awaits the arrival of the accused. Among the chief witnesses for the prosecution were Albert Lebrun, President of the French Republic in 1940, and Paul Reynaud. There he is in the center. Then Pétain himself arrives, in the 7-starred uniform of a Marshal of France and wearing only one decoration, the Médaille Militaire he received for his work in the last war. Now, at the end of another war, he stands trial for treason against the Republic. Outwardly, he is composed, but you can see by the way he handles his papers that inwardly he is greatly affected. After an adjournment, the clerk read the indictment, a grave series of charges, and the trial began in earnest. The judge was then about to question the accused when Pétain asked leave to speak. The request was granted, and the Marshal made it clear that this was the only time he would speak. "I shall make no further statement," he said. "I shall not reply to a single question, for a Marshal of France asks mercy from none." After this statement, disturbances again broke out, and the court had to be cleared. And so ended the first day of the trial for treason of Henri-Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun.
Okay, so as you can see, the tensions were actually quite high during the trial of Pétain. Pétain himself was convicted, was sentenced to death. The Gaul commuted his death sentence, but there was actually a lot of people who felt very sorry for Pétain. Harry Truman, the American president, actually said that Pétain would be willing to live as an exile in the United States if the Gaul wanted to get him off French hands. But the Gaul insisted no, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, and he did remain in prison for I think the next 7 years. He died in the early 1950s at the age of 95. But Pétain was spared. This was not the same fate for other members of the government who had participated. Let me just. Pierre Laval, for example, was captured as well, and his fate was. So Laval was executed, as were a number of other leading members of the Vichy government. In total, the French state handed down 1,500 death sentences for those who were involved with the Vichy government, although actually the vast majority of those were commuted. But Laval and some other senior figures were indeed executed. There was hope amongst those who had been involved in the resistance, a sense of unity, that things would now be different, that the spirit that had united communists, Catholics, socialists, conservatives, all kinds of stripes of French society in rejecting the German or the Nazi occupation of France, that could be brought together as a sense of spirit of togetherness that could be harnessed to create a new France. Although in reality, that proved to be kind of an illusion, and as once liberation had been achieved, the divisions amongst these different groups became apparent again. The one party, you get the joke, Communist Party, the one group that had most confidence for the future of New France was the Communist Party. The Communists had played an outsized role in the resistance. They expected to be fully rewarded for a large say in government after the war. And to hopefully begin building towards a socialist or communist France. Although interestingly, the Soviet Union government did not support the Communist Party who wanted to take over France. By this stage, Stalin had kind of agreed to divide Europe east and west, with the east having a communist influence. So he was not as enthusiastic about communism spreading to France anymore. The person who obviously was most opposed to the Communist Party was Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was concerned with the Communist Party. He played very little role. Well, not just the Communist Party, the resistance in general. He saw that those who participated in the resistance as a kind of a threat to his own power. He was worried that they would try and claim a greater legitimacy than he had in terms of governing France, because they had played a more active role on the ground in France during the war. And so he quite quickly sidelined leading members of the resistance and tried to keep them out of the government. And he ordered, as soon as Paris had been liberated, he ordered resistance units to disband and either join the regular army, which he had controlled, or to go back to civilian life. So for de Gaulle, it was important to try and sideline the resistance in general, the leaders of the resistance, the communists in particular, because they threatened his vision for what post-war France should look like. As president of France, de Gaulle tried to do whatever he could to return France to the top table of international powers. He travelled to the Soviet Union. This is de Gaulle here pictured with Joseph Stalin. He travelled to the Soviet Union in the fall of 1944, trying to create the image that France was a world power, was one of the leading allies, and then also trying to revive the old alliance between France and what was Russia, the Soviet Union. But this only had moderate success. The Allies, the British, Americans, and Russians did tolerate him to an extent, but when it came to the two big post-war conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, France was excluded. So France kind of was kept on the outside. That de Gaulle was kind of made to realise that it was not at the top table amongst the Allied leadership. The next decision, of course, was what was going to happen in France, what kind of government would emerge in France. So when elections were held in 1945, after the final defeat of Germany, the three major parties that emerged were the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and they were helped by the fact that they were seen as the most anti-German, anti-Nazi during the war. There was a new political party, the Mouvement Républicain Populaire, the Popular Republican Movement, which was more of a centrist movement, albeit one with willing to work with the Socialists and the Communists towards building a new post-war consensus. You can see the results of the election here. So the Communist Party, partly because of its role in resistance, partly because the Soviet Union was viewed in a more positive light in France in 1945 due to its role in defeating Nazi Germany. The Communist Party emerged as the biggest party, slightly ahead of the Movement Populaire Républicain, the Popular Republican Movement, and the Socialist Party in third place. So they were the three main parties that dominated the first election in post-war France. The question was, what role would de Gaulle play with these parties? Because these parties themselves did not align with him. The more traditional parties that had existed in the Third Republic essentially dissolved. They were simply not popular enough to kind of merit votes in the election of 1945. So de Gaulle was very interested in what kind of government should be formed, and de Gaulle in particular wanted to create a strong executive. That's what I'm going for here, the strong executive that de Gaulle very much favoured the American presidential system, where you have the executive authority is rested in the hands of one person, and that person would have considerable authority in the government. This was not a popular idea, of course, in 1945. That sounded to a lot of people a lot like what Pétain had been kind of doing, and obviously was associated with fascist dictatorship as well. So the idea did not win many allies, and de Gaulle kind of realised that the three main political parties were not going to kind of cooperate with that idea. So in early 1946, he kind of took a political gamble and quit. Basically quit as the head of the provisional government as France was waiting for a new constitution, and said he was retiring. He was assuming he would be called back very quickly to be the leader of France, but actually he was more or less sidelined after that. So what did the three main parties, what political system did they envision? So let's give you a Jeopardy question from the Latin for one chamber. It is a type of assembly that does not have a second house. It is unicameral. And a second Jeopardy question. This state voted in 1937 to replace a bicameral legislature, that is a two-house parliament, with a unicameral one, and is the only state to have such a legislative body. Any answers? So Nebraska. The new party, the new political parties proposed a system of government where there would be a unicameral parliament, so one parliament that essentially would control everything, with a very weak executive branch. That was put to the voters of France in 1946 for an election. You can see the votes here. Actually, most people, a majority voted against it, so it was defeated. And the leading parties had to go back to the drawing board once more. So as new efforts were made to create a new constitution, because this first one had been rejected, de Gaulle re-emerged from retirement and began to advocate once more, we need to have a strong executive authority, we need to have a presidential system like the American one, not a kind of weak, or as he saw, weak parliamentary system like the Third Republic. But de Gaulle was largely ignored. The new proposal was for something that actually kind of looked a lot like what existed during the Third Republic. Basically, there would be a popular vote to elect the National Assembly, the main parliament, the lower house. Then the Senate, what we'll call the Senate, the Council of the Republic, would be partly chosen or mostly chosen by the municipal government. So 5/6 of the seats in the Senate chosen by municipal government, 1/6 chosen by the National Assembly. The Council of the Republic and the National Assembly would then choose the president, who would pick the president of the council, effectively the prime minister, who would pick the cabinet. So it was a bit convoluted, a lot like the Third Republic. This one actually did win popular support, albeit not overwhelming popular support. So this is the birth of the Fourth Republic under these terms, under a political system that looks a lot like the Third Republic. Only 2/3 of the French voters actually took part in the election, and this caused de Gaulle to comment, a third of the French were resigned to it, a third rejected it, and a third ignored it altogether. So the Fourth Republic, using similar institutions to those that had existed in the Third Republic, was brought into existence in 1946.